Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar today from Hyperproof. My name is JC. I want to say welcome. And before we get started, a few housekeeping items. First of all, our webinar today is called Beyond COVID-19, How to Build a Strong Risk and Compliance Management Function. And we have 60 minutes together. During the presentation, if you have any questions, please just type them into the Q&A box you see in front of me. We'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. And also, this webinar is being recorded, so you will receive an email to the on-demand recording within 48 hours. And with that, let's get started. I want to turn things over to Craig Unger, Hyperproof's founder and CEO, to kick things off, introduce himself, and our guest, Matt.
Thanks, JC. So good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, I guess, if you're East Coast. My name is Craig Unger, and I'm the founder and CEO of Hyperproof. I'm going to introduce myself fairly quickly, and then I'm going to introduce Matt, our guest speaker this morning. So a little bit about me. I've been in the industry for almost 30 years. I spent 20 years of it at Microsoft working on some of their largest enterprise products, so Microsoft Access, Microsoft Excel, Microsoft Dynamics CRM. And while I was at Microsoft, we were really challenged in terms of how we did compliance. And all told, with all my experience there, it caused me to take a really long, hard look at how we can make this industry better. And so about 2 years ago, I started a company called Hyperproof, which I'm sure you're familiar with if you're in this webinar, and we'll talk a little bit more about it later. But that's a little bit about me. Hyperproof, in a word, is all about bringing you continuous compliance. So that's the purpose of the company. We really want to kind of further that mission and make it easier for organizations like yours to stay compliant every day. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But in the meantime, I'd like to introduce Matt Kelly. So Matt's our guest speaker, and he's the editor of Radical Compliance, which is one of my favorite compliance publications. We all read it voraciously here at Hyperproof. And Matt has a lot of accolades, which he probably won't share, so I'm going to share for him. Matt was named to Ethic's most influential in business ethic twice in the last number of years. In 2018, he won a Reader's Choice Award from J.D. Super as one of the top 10 authors on corporate compliance. And previously, in the period of time between 2006 and 2015, Matt was the editor of Compliance Week. So great experience, Matt. Thanks for joining us today.
Oh, happy to be here, Craig. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, let's kick things off. So, the topic of the webinar this morning is all of the, compliance activity and how you can build a strong function in the era of COVID. So what better way to kick off this webinar other than to say, hey, given the environment, Matt, obviously a lot of things have changed, with COVID in terms of how we're all interacting, how we're working. To some degree, the definition of business continuity itself has changed, given that, it's going to be a little bit more about people going forward than just about machines and technology and infrastructure. How would you characterize the current risk environment as it relates to some of the changes that have happened during this COVID-19 era?
Yeah, well, I would probably say that there are a few forces at work here. Yes, certainly. COVID does introduce some new risks to corporations, and we can get to those, and those are risks that we might be not familiar with. But I think more than the new risks, what COVID is really doing is amplifying or complicating existing risks that the companies already had. And I'll give you a few examples. So security, fraud, vendor risk, regulatory filings that might have to be done in certain ways or certain formats by certain deadlines. None of those things are new to any corporation of any significant size. We've been dealing with those kind of headaches for a long while, but they manifest in different ways with COVID. So, for example, let's go back to security and fraud. The threat actors out there are exploiting the opportunities. They're acting more aggressively. They're being a bit more insidious and persistent because they know the data is out there and they know it's vulnerable because all of their targets, which are everybody listening on the webcast, we are all in a state of sort of jumbled disarray. So the fraudsters figure, okay, now I can step up my game because my targets are more vulnerable. Software tools. We are using tools either that we have not used before, especially around electronic communications, or we are using tools in new ways that we never really intended. My favorite example is Zoom. And, for example, was it ever the case that a CISO and a board director used Zoom to talk before? Well, yeah, sure. I'm sure it was along the lines of, we need to talk in person. When are you free? You want to talk of Zoom, use Zoom to talk that way. That's fine, because everybody had been thinking, it's not like we'd ever have a board meeting on Zoom. It's not like we would ever have a strategy session on Zoom. But come March with COVID, now suddenly we all said, yikes, we need to figure this out right now. We need to talk. Let's use Zoom, a tool that we had used in a new way. And a lot of it is that. A lot of it is that these previously interpersonal communications or interactions that we had, they're now unfolding online because we're all working remotely. We're all using these new tools. So that means a lot of revisiting policies and procedures, or identifying new risks, or implementing new remediation steps. You're probably going to be using different methods to actually do the remediation too, because just like everybody else, you, the compliance and security function, you're stuck working at home with tools you didn't really think you would. And how do we figure that out? So a lot of what we've already had before, we still have it. It's just, it feels very different. It's different size or different shape or different manifestations, but the risks aren't new. The two things that I would call out that are really new because of COVID, you have a much bigger realm of activity that you would need to consider, say, around business continuity, because you're looking at the viability or reliability of new suppliers, different suppliers, your current suppliers who might be under profound economic distress, your customers. Business continuity now is not just about my business is ready to go and we've got the VPN and everybody's working from home. That's great if you're there, but business continuity is much more about the whole ecosystem of your business, your suppliers, your customers, everybody else, and your ability to continue as a going concern. It's really much more along those lines now. And if you're ready to go, that's great. But if your partners aren't, then you're still stuck in the soup. Craig, I'm sorry. What was your what did you have to say?
Yeah. Well, I was gonna reiterate what you're saying, which is around the digital processes. I think we all thought that the world was moving toward this pace of digital, at this frenetic rate before COVID. But I think one of the biggest things is that things that we didn't think would be digital, to your point on Zoom, are now completely digital. Everything's having to happen. I mean, in our space in compliance, audits have to happen remotely, all kinds of, obviously, things like signatures and consulting with your lawyer, and very big decisions that typically were done in person, have now been digitized at a pace which, we thought was fast before, but is now so much faster. And I think that is an incredible vector for how, we need to modernize and very quickly in this era.
Craig, you bring up a great point, and I would even maybe say that how is the risk landscape changing? It's compressed. That's the word, really. You were talking about digital signatures and legal transactions. I had no doubt 6 months ago that we'd be doing all of that online by like 2030. I didn't realize that a pandemic would make us need to figure out how to do all of that by July. But that's where we are, and that's really the force. If you wanted one adjective to describe it, it's compressed. Everything that we had to worry about over the course of many years, now we're worrying about it because it's going to happen in a quarter, and that's what's going on.
That's right. That's right. Well, great. Let's move on to the next topic we'd like to chat about, which is what capabilities do you think businesses have to develop in order to effectively address all these new risks, that quick move towards digitization, and some of the new risks around fraud and other pieces that you raised due to COVID?
Yeah, I flagged 4 that I would recommend people think about. First, you're going to need to collaborate with other parts of the enterprise that are living and breathing these risks and going through all of the procedures that we typically had and have been turned upside down. I'm sure many people in audit or compliance have heard the kind of the cliche phrase for many years that to succeed as a function, you really need to get to know the business and be relevant and be taken seriously. That was always the phrase, you have to know the business. This moment is the big test of that theory, is that if you really want to help the organization, or you really want to succeed with what the challenges are, you need to know how your exact business really operates, because everything is going to be changing. They're still the same people. It's still the same sort of business model, still the same sort of customer base and supplier base you're using, but very different challenges now. And if you can't help everybody else in your enterprise because you don't really know what you're doing, or you're living in a compliance bubble, that's not going to be good. I'm even struck by something that an audit committee member at a publicly traded tech company, she told me a couple of weeks ago. I was speaking with her, and she said, stop with all of the lingo and the standards and everything else. I am here to make sure that my business is still viable. I am up against the scariest opponent I have ever seen. Just tell me how what you want to do is relevant to keeping the business going. And it was a very arresting sort of a comment, but I think it's spot on for what a lot of senior executives are worried about. The second capability I think people need is strong monitoring capabilities. Some of that could be done by the CISO or IT security function in a really sort of like hardcore security monitoring around unusual network activity or penetration alerts that you might get or something like that. But other monitoring that I'm talking about would be more studying unusual transaction patterns, unusual spending patterns, unusual sorts of changes in the third parties that you're working with, that you're using maybe for software applications or something like that. Why is this changing? But if you can't get that rolling sense of how is what we're doing today different than yesterday, if you can't detect those things, you're really going to be on the back foot. The third skill that I was thinking about is just training and executive communication for the whole workforce, so that employees will be more risk aware generally, because some processes, especially everything that we have kind of shoved into the online remote working world really fast, we weren't expecting to do that. A lot of these processes are probably going to be creating new risks that don't necessarily have enough compensating controls yet. So in that case, when you have some risks and there are no compensating controls you can come up with and insert on the fly, the backup really is going to be clear policy, effective training, strong tone at the top to get employees to be aware of what the risk is. That's going to have to be the compensating control until you can come up with something more structured. I'll give you a couple of examples of what I mean. First, like I had said before, the use of Zoom or other electronic communications. We've all used those kind of communications before, but now we're maybe using them in a very different way for much more confidential information that we would never use or discuss, or be shipping around confidential data with these tools if they hadn't been vetted. But it might be that you had to use a tool, a software application that's right there. Now you're going to start using it. And you have to do that. So you have to start thinking, should I send this message right now on this tool, or should I be risk aware enough that maybe I should just, use the phone or something like that? A second sort of example of what I mean for be risk aware and understand how remote working is changing us. I like this example a lot, is workplace conduct around, say, bullying and harassment. And I know for a lot of IT security officers and CISOs, you're probably thinking, well, what does that got to do with my job? Consider this. In person, we have all have a certain sense of good judgment. We're not going to say this sort of bold and offensive thing live in a board meeting with everybody around the conference table, but our judgment goes out the window when we're talking electronically. And we've all done this. We've all said something dumb on email or something provocative on Facebook or Twitter. And, how would abusive workplace behaviors manifest in online communications? Because our good judgment might be lacking for a time being. So you have to think about Oh, go
Let me
ahead.
give you an example of that, which is interesting. Recently at our company at Hyperproof, we started doing virtual team meetings because we wanted to stay connected.
Yeah,
And one of the things we
sure.
started doing is we were playing games, actually. And there's been a real upsurge in people downloading games for Slack or games for Zoom and things like that. And one of the games required people to respond really, really quickly. And the idea was to try to be funny, what you were responding to. And without going to the specifics, people went a little too far, and it opened up, a couple of interesting issues like, those are things that you would have said if we were sitting around the table at our office. But, when we were playing online and there was a speed component, people went a little too far, right? And so I think those kind of modes of interaction are very, are much more common right now than they were before.
And so, think through, how would somebody try and say something insidious by using emojis, or they're much more opportune for them to say, well, that's not really what I meant, when of course it was what they meant. And how would that lead to tense workplace environments? How could it lead to litigation? Do you investigate that sort of stuff? There's all sorts of new risks that are existing online that because of the tools that previously in person, we probably would have been better judges about how to handle it. So that's something else that executives are going to need to think through. How do we train for it? How do we have a policy for it? And if something does blow up in our face, like, how do we investigate that? How do we document it? How do we figure out what our litigation exposure is? There's a lot of issues like that that are going to straddle the HR realm, the technology realm, and the legal realm. And I don't know what the answer will be yet, but like I said, we would have figured that out by 2030. Now we have to figure it out by Q3. And that's the sort of challenge that we have today. And the last core sort of capability I would recommend people have, I didn't want to forget this, is confidence in your data. Really becomes much more important, because the verifying that we might use, even just to lean over a cubicle wall and say, did you mean this? Did you include this? That interpersonal dimension has gone away. So we really have to think about completeness and accuracy of reports, a common taxonomy of your risks and the data, so that everybody is working from a consensus and a single source of truth. That can even touch on document retention policies, data governance, and the like, and they can all factor into this. I even wanted to single out specifically data governance, and why this is so important for some firms out there. That's going to be a real regulatory issue. So my example that I love to talk about is FINRA. They are the regulator for broker-dealer firms. FINRA actually has pandemic guidance out there. And one point that its pandemic guidance raises is the availability of critical data. So if people are storing important data or documents on their personal hard drive, rather than on some sort of central data repository where others can get access to it, that is a compliance risk. That is a security risk, because the hackers are going to go after that hard drive. It can even be an operational risk if you have sensitive data there and you get COVID and you're incapacitated for several weeks. These kind of things can tie your compliance capability up in knots. So where your data is, and you know that you have it and it's reliable and we all understand what it is, that's another tremendously important capability that we're going to need.
Thanks for that, Matt. As you were speaking, one of the things that highlights to me is, which is really interesting, soft skill around addressing these risks. You look at your point on know the business, you look at your point on improving the risk awareness among employees and among your peers. And one of the things, and in the folks we've talked to around our product, we've heard this too, is that folks in this compliance area are being expected to get out there more, go and take responsibility for things that they didn't necessarily ever think would be on their plate, right? Because usually there's a pretty well-trodden set of risks that the company has developed and understood over time. Now things change a lot. Now they've got to actually get in front of some things that they didn't think they had to get in front of, and they're being looked at by people who didn't look to them before, and then they have to be more proactive in going out and educating. And so it's all of a sudden it's almost like the spotlight is being shown on folks who are doing this kind of compliance work. It's almost like, that if you're fighting a war, you bring in a specialist, right? That's like the specialist that we have now in this area. So I've seen people who are, maybe need to work a little bit more on their presentation skills and how much they're willing to get out there, and are they willing to initiate those meetings and those kinds of things in this kind of very compressed period of time.
Yeah, that's all very true.
So moving along, the next topic we want to chat with you about, Matt, is what role should compliance professionals play at this time? Where are there opportunities to really step up in a way that they really wouldn't have had the COVID pandemic not happen?
Oh, there are a lot of ways you could step up. I have a list. One very practical way, I think, would actually be anti-fraud programs, because as we had mentioned a couple of slides ago, fraud risk is definitely out there, and it is evolving in ways that could be very insidious and dangerous for a lot of companies out there. But if your organization doesn't already have, say, a VP of internal audit at a larger company, they would have that role, and that person would probably be in charge of running the anti-fraud program, thinking about anti-fraud controls, assessing fraud risk. Or if you are specifically in some sort of retail or consumer-facing business, you might have a VP of loss prevention or somebody else who very clearly owns anti-fraud. For the vast majority of the rest of us who are not necessarily in consumer-facing businesses, or you're at a smaller firm without a strong audit function, you still have the fraud risk, and somebody's going to have to own it. And I would put forth that maybe people with compliance capabilities or responsibilities, they might be potential candidates to take on the anti-fraud program. Another good question to ask in this situation is, if not me, who? If somebody doesn't take charge of it, it could wind up that the lines of business are running their own anti-fraud programs, which does not strike me as a very wise approach. There's a lot of siloed activity that could go on, or a lot of different sort of approaches to anti-fraud. And then you get different levels of success across the enterprise. And if you ever have an incident or a regulatory review, and it looks like you don't have your ducks lined up in a row, that's not good. So somebody somewhere has to own anti-fraud. That would be one area where a compliance officer might be reasonably saying, okay, we could probably try that. You definitely want to think about your internal reporting system. And I know that in broader corporate ethics and compliance, that is a very core duty for them. But I think it is just something for compliance officers of any stripe to just think about. The nature and the volume of your calls right now, they could change dramatically because of COVID. And so any sort of a trend analysis about your internal reports could provide really very interesting insights into the risks that you have or the flaws in business processes. You could wind up looking at that data, drawing conclusions, and saying, let's brief more more line of business executives on what is going on with the reporting. What are we seeing from these internal reports? I know one compliance officer who typically would have briefed the senior executive team once a month or once a quarter about, here's what's coming in from the hotline. Here's what our employees and third parties are telling us is weird and going wrong. Once a month or once a quarter. COVID came along, their internal reports doubled within a week, and he started giving the other lines of business updates on what's happening every day for weeks on end. As far as I know, he still is doing that. But it became a really valuable source of insight if you knew how to extract it and study it and pass it along to the business. So that is something to think about. How could you step up is try and run that exercise. I also think that more broadly, you could really expand the compliance function's role or domain from regulatory compliance to broader enterprise risk management, because a lot of your biggest risks right now, they're going to be real and big, but they're not really going to be regulatory issues per se. But what is the board going to care about? The board is going to care about the biggest and most important issues. So if you can help them, if you can build a system that informs them on these risks, I don't think the board is going to get hung up on you being outside of your lane and talking about a non-compliance issue. They're just going to say, are you giving us good intel? Awesome. Give us more. Right. So that could be anything from operational risks, sick policies that may or may not be working. Again, if you don't do it, who is going to tackle these issues? the lines of business and the managers who are going to be making this up on the fly, and they may not have the expertise or uniformity across the whole enterprise. And then you've got a mishmash and you don't necessarily know what's happening, and that is not what the board would want. That's not what regulators want. So like building a risk management function or leveraging it, that's another really good potential way to step up right now. I have a few other ideas more around security in particular. Definitely, your organization is going to need more assurances, or be able to provide more assurances to your customers and your partners that your capabilities are secure, your ability to provide a service is reliable, you can keep your customer data confidential. They're all going to be wanting more of that. So the more quickly you can provide that, the more systematically the company can do that, the better. I always like to say the better you are at governing yourself, the more attractive you become as a business partner to your customers. Yeah, because what do they worry about? They worry about third parties. We are all somebody else's third party. So the more you can govern yourself and your third parties, then you go to your customers and they say, I have less third-party risk from this outfit right here. I have less fourth-party risk to worry about because they have their third parties in tow. Like, that's all going to make you a more attractive business partner these days. That's going to become a big, big thing.
I think that this idea that, you can use this as an opportunity to compete more effectively by actually showing how seriously your organization is taking it, documenting it, and really getting out in front of it. That's something that at Hyperproof we decided to do very early into, this COVID phenomenon pandemic. We published new offerings that were goodwill offerings to help people in the privacy area. We actually added features like a Zoom feature to our product to make sure that we can actually help people during this time. But I think people remember that, right? They remember what actions you took when the times were tough, right? So it sounds like, just kind of summarizing it, we've already talked about there's a whole lot more work to do, but the real theme in a lot of these items is stepping up, stepping out, expanding, doing things you might not have thought you needed to do, challenging yourself from being kind of maybe more reactive and focused on kind of the risks that were historical to being kind of more of a discoverer or an explorer who's out there really looking for kind of more ground to cover in your risk management and your compliance management activities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you would definitely need to think about what is the IT management system that you have or the compliance management system to run all of that. But I continue to believe that compliance and risk management are going to fuse into one souped up sort of a function, because so many of the risks that the board worries about, they might touch on regulatory issues, they might touch on security, but they might be operational in nature. But we rely on tech so much for the operations that, is a security risk and an operational risk, are they really that different? And splitting those kind of hairs, you're missing the point, because remember what the audit committee person had said to me that I mentioned about 5 minutes ago. She's like, don't come to me with that. My business is teetering. I'm terrified of the landscape right now. Help me run the business. So if you can treat compliance and risk management as a way to keep the enterprise more agile and responsive, that's what the board wants. That's what the CEO wants. Everybody starts to get happy.
Well, that's great. And that's actually a really good segue when it comes to keeping the business running too. I'm sure a question that's on everybody's mind, both working in security and compliance. And I would say anybody who's, kind of selling anything into any enterprise, obviously with a pandemic like this, the first thing that happens is CFOs, they start to, take more control of the purse strings and say, hey, no more purchases unless it's absolutely mission critical, and things really grind to a halt. It doesn't mean the underlying need changed, but certainly the pace of spending. Yeah. So the question I have for you is, how can compliance leaders today make a really strong case for the budget that they need, especially given all the additional challenges that you outlined? And frankly, to be candid, we've seen examples where people now have fewer employees and human resources to actually deal with those challenges. So how do you actually make the case for budget to actually help do this critical work at this critical time?
Well, you have to think it through in a couple of different dimensions. And first, I always want to say, I understand where the CFOs are coming from. This cannot be an easy or comfortable time to be running the finances. I mean, the economy is terrible right now. It might be terrible for many months. and this is the CFO's job. So I wouldn't blame them necessarily for being stingy with the purse strings, but I would try and figure out, what are some of the strategic imperatives that are going to exist here, and frankly, a risk here. If your budget is tight or not, the risk is there, and the risk is going to strike, period, and you have to address it somehow. So the more you can address it in a way that also adds some value to the business, the better. What I mean is that, let's say you have a grand idea for a big technology investment, and the CFO says, nope, we're going to do this the old-fashioned way. Well, the old-fashioned way is by manual processes, by spreadsheets, by emails, chasing down information. But the work is still going to get done. It's just not going to get done as effectively. It's not going to get done as accurately. It's not going to get done in a timely manner. So I would put forth that you can either spend X number of dollars right now to try and get ahead of these things, or you can spend X plus $10 eventually, because, somebody somewhere is going to get to do it. It's going to take more time on the man hours. It's going to distract people from their other parts of their job, or you're not going to do it at all, and then you could have what we'll call an adverse risk event. But once that happens, once you have a regulatory failure or a data breach, again, the risk and the regulators and the lawsuits coming at you, they don't care that your budget is tight or not. They're going to come after you. It's going to cost you much more to clean it up. So you can always argue that investing more now to build up your capability to be responsive and better over time, it's not pleasant, but then the alternative is also not going to be pleasant eventually. It's just, when is the unpleasantness going to arrive? You can have a little bit of budgetary investment right now and pain, and when CFOs spend money, that's their definition of pain. They don't want to spend any. But they can spend a little bit right now, or they could spend a whole lot more some other time down the road. I also think, go ahead. Yeah.
I think one of the other things also is that, the optics on risks that aren't managed right now are very different, because people are in a very high pressure environment right now, and they're, when you actually are choosing your business partners during a time of this kind of, pandemic stress and overall risk in the economy and out there in the world, I think you're more tuned to these issues of risk. So you would argue it's kind of not the right time to take your foot off the pedal on some of these things, because the risk and the detriment that you do to your business is going to resonate far beyond the time frame of this actual pandemic. So some of it comes down, I think, to having the wherewithal to invest into this, realizing that you want to be one of the companies that come out stronger on the other end.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that compliance officers should probably do some of their math homework to sit down and figure out what is the actual ROI of this investment, which you can do. And you'll have to sit down and figure out what is the amount of man-hour time we spend right now on this compliance task. And let's say it is 2 hours a week of every salesman's time is spent on, due diligence of a vendor or a supplier or something like that. But that is 5% of the sales executives' time is spent on compliance. Well, how much does the sales team cost? The HR department can tell you that. Add in their salary, add in all their benefits, add in all of the other costs that they have. And then this is our total spend on the sales team. 5% of that is devoted to compliance time, and it's X in the number of dollars. Well, if we invest in this amount right now, that will cut it from 5% of the time, 2 hours, down to 15 minutes a week. And now we're spending less money. They're wasting less of their sales time on compliance. So you're saving that money. They are devoting more time to potential sales. So your sales could conceivably go up. And if all of that savings adds up to more than what you're spending on compliance and on the investment, then it's worth it. And you can think through those things. You can sit down and do the math. It's not necessarily fun. It can be tedious, but it's just math. And you could sit down and do a cost-benefit analysis to the CFO and the C-suite about why is this necessary. And if you're looking at the right sort of solution that alleviates the compliance burden you're asking for the first line of defense business units, if you're helping to get the compliance embedded into what they do and automating a lot of those tasks, and you're taking the compliance burden off of them, there is no employee in the world who would say, I miss those compliance duties. Please give them back to me. They all want this. As soon as you say, I can automate this and let you do what you're paid to actually do in R&D, in sales, in marketing, and HR, they're all like, yeah, sure, this is awesome. Sign us up. So, you have to think through what is the actual arithmetic and the financial ROI, but that's calculatable. And you can definitely do that.
Great. Yeah, it sounds like quantify and make that argument for being really efficient and effective, especially in a time where other parts of the company may have lost people or may not have the same kind of human resources that they did before. So now that we've kind of figured out that there's a lot more to be done in this really compressed time, takes a little bit of a different attitude and a different person and a different approach to try to do it, and it takes budget in a pretty difficult time. If you've been able to line all of that up, Matt, and you've gotten that far, how would you assess, how would you know that you've got an effective compliance program and that you actually have mitigated your risks down according to plan?
Well, I think first we all have to admit that at least for the ensuing 3-6 months or so, at least, I don't know, we're not sure. Those are valid answers because we have never encountered a pandemic in this sort of an integrated world before. There is so much uncertainty that is really challenging business models and fundamental assumptions that what is effective in one period may not be effective in 3 to 6 months, or what is effective in one part of the business might not necessarily work well in the other. So we all have to appreciate, and I would raise that with senior teams and the board, that this is an experimental, improvisational thing. That said, we do have a couple of ideas about what probably would be a good measure of success. From a strategic standpoint, and Craig, you had asked, how do people know they're doing things right? Well, doing things right means that the organization is still able to achieve its compliance objectives or achieve its business objectives that the board and senior management set out. So are we still able to pursue the goals that we want? That's the question to ask. If the answer is yes, we can, then you are succeeding. If the answer is no, this is getting harder for us, then you might be slipping away or slipping off track. And then you'd have to sit down and think about how do we get a course correction going. But fundamentally, are we still able to achieve the business goals that we can? Is it harder for us to do? Is it taking us longer? Are we less coordinated? Those are the kind of questions you'd want to ask. You really want to get a sense of employee engagement. Are they actually listening to and are they following policy and procedure? That is really important because that is the difference between a paper compliance program and a compliance program that actually works. All paper compliance programs always look awesome. They inevitably, but nobody cares about that when the adverse risk event happens. It's really about, do we have an actual program that people take seriously and they put into effect, especially in an economy that has been hobbled by COVID, which it certainly has. You might need to rely more on employee engagement and enthusiasm while you are trying to build up the new controls and the monitoring and everything else that you want. For a time being, for some period, it might just be about, are the employees on our side and they're working with us as best they can? And how do you get that sense of engagement? Maybe we could talk about that if time allows, but that's going to be a critical metric too. I do also think that you can still look for improvement of some standard metrics over time. And how is that evolving? So number of security incidents, time elapsed from finding a security flaw until you patch it, vendor due diligence completion rates or completion times, the number of internal reports to a compliance hotline, the number of times management has to override internal controls. How's that changing from quarter to quarter? You can track all sorts of things like that. Time to remediate an internal control weakness. How long does that take? What is that compared to a year ago or 2 years ago? You want to see those metrics over time. And I would say that is much more important than what the metric actually is at any time. You want to track the change. So any trend analysis you can do, that's going to be crucial too.
Yeah, one of the things that, as I'm listening to you speak, Matt, one of the things I would add also is, especially due to the COVID period of time that we're in, is coverage. Because the coverage is what's really changing. We've taken, inside the company, we've talked a lot about business continuity. And we said, through all the time I've been doing audits, business continuity has really been about how are your servers situated? What happens if your data center got flooded or caught on fire, and how fast can you switch over, let's say, to another data center? But what does the concept of business continuity mean when really nobody's within 6 feet or 60 feet or 600 feet of one another? So you start to look at business continuity through a different lens, which is the lens of the individuals as opposed to the lens of the machines. And I'm just giving that by way of example of how the coverage, the surface area of what you're trying to assess has changed so radically, so fast that it's kind of interesting. The flip side of that is if you look at the systems that you've tried to harden inside your company, some of those may have not been used for the last 2 months, right? Like an internal network may be barely being used, maybe some VPN, but some of the other resources on there not being used. And now all of a sudden, like your point from before around Zoom, all of a sudden there's a whole set of things we didn't expect to be used that are. So I think this idea of coverage really can help in the assessment, but also help in the budgeting piece that we were talking about before too, which is to talk about the fact that we've got fewer people to help us, but we've actually got a much bigger area due to a surface area due to a different environment.
I'm glad you mentioned the fewer people there, because I think that is the flip side of the expanded coverage. That is absolutely true, expanded coverage, but we have, in most organizations, fewer people now doing the coverage. Something as simple as, I don't know, you've got two-phase control that typically happens. Person one does this, and then person two signs off on it. But now we've gotten rid of person one. So how do we do that? Or does person two do person one's job? Or what if we've consolidated them into only one actual person? How does the control work? How does compliance assure that they know that we laid off person one? And, is compliance going to be involved in all of this? But very different sort of challenges now that it's really about, are the people actually there to do all of this? And like I said before, the paper compliance program always looks good. But if the people aren't there to actually support it, or you're not updating the program to reflect the people on the ground, then the paper program is not going to be worth much.
Right. At the end of the day, a lot of the compliance controls are around processes, and processes that more often than not include the employees themselves. And so being resilient to that, I think, is very, very important. So, when we talk about, how we measure, we talk about some of the qualitative pieces just now around how you're being successful. But what about I think this is our last topic before we go to Q&A. Can you talk to us a little bit about metrics themselves? What metrics would you recommend that are things that you actually can measure to make sure that your efforts are actually headed in the right direction?
Well, so first, if you do have an internal reporting hotline of some kind, and most companies of any significant size, they've got some sort, that is always going to be a invaluable resource material, because really the single biggest source of wisdom in your organization is going to be employees telling you something somewhere here doesn't seem right, and somebody should do something about it. So you are the person who has to do something about it, but really look at your internal reporting metrics if you have them. Track your quote-unquote regular issues versus COVID-specific issues. Is the mix of that changing? Do you suddenly see many more complaints or many more internal reports that are somehow related to a COVID issue versus your more traditional complaints about vendors not working or managers being a jerk or whatever? Track the locations of where your internal reporting are coming from, what level of employee might be doing the reporting. The more granular you can be with any internal reporting data, the better. Some of the trend analysis might not be relevant, but if you can't do the trend analysis at all, then you're going to be missing something there. So the more granular you can be, the better your trend analysis with internal reports, the better. Security incidents, examine those. I would actually say, even if whenever possible, do a post-mortem on each specific incident that it comes up. How did this happen? What controls didn't work or weren't present? How can we remediate that control or introduce a compensating control? Or how do we know if we're stuck with this for the time being? And you want to do that ideally for every incident that comes along, but if possible, scale up that process across all of the incidents that you have, all of the policy failures. And that will help to help you to understand, do you have a failure at the transaction level? Do you have a failure at the process level? Do you have a failure at the personnel level because personnel are no longer present? But to gain the really deep insights, you need to see all of this scale. So that's what you also want to look at is security incidents. The more analysis you can do of them at scale, the better. I am a big fan of tracking your third parties and how they change over time. Do you have more of them? Do you have less of them? Do you have more high-risk third parties or fewer? The percentage of third parties whose engagement only begins after a compliance check is done, is that rising? Is it falling? Do you have more third parties who are somehow on your network and you've got no idea who they are or how they got there, and there's no compliance check yet, but they're there? Is that number increasing or falling? The goal is really to see how your due diligence efforts are working and whether they are being ignored by employees in the operating functions, and if so, why? Is because they don't know to pay attention to it, or the burdens are so much they don't have the time for compliance and all of that? And if that's the case, then could you course correct by automating some of this compliance burden off of their plate? But third-party activity and intelligence will tell you a lot about how the employees actually work and how your policies and controls do or don't actually work. The other two that I would have would be, consider any metrics you can create about your confidential data and how well that is protected. For example, how many third-party systems touch that confidential data? Is that rising or falling? How many phishing tests that you run might result in some employee falling for it and sharing confidential data, even when it's just a test that you're running yourself, but what's that percentage of people who might not understand what confidential data is or how it should be treated? And then the last thing that I would say is any tests you can run on provisioning IT access, and especially how quickly you decommission departing employees, especially now if we are decommissioning and departing a significant chunk of your workforce. Since those lonely abandoned access controls, the user IDs, they can be an enormous security risk. So how confident are you that when you do decommission a user, that gets shut down before they leave the building? That's the goal. So those kind of things. What kind of intelligence could you get around that? That would be my other suggestion.
Great stuff, Matt. Thanks for that. Okay, so we are going to move on. We're going to transition to see if there's any Q&A, but before we do that, I'm going to spend no more than 60 seconds telling you guys a little bit about Hyperproof. Hyperproof is really the world's first cloud continuous compliance system. And what does that even mean? Well, here's what it means. Today we have more programs that we have to deal with than ever before, more security programs. We have the rise of privacy with GDPR, CCPA. We've got 40 states that are working on privacy programs. And as Matt was just talking about with partners, we have a zero risk environment, a zero trust environment rather, that doesn't really allow you to necessarily work with your partners the way you used to without actually doing some compliance work and auditing their processes too. So it all turns into a lot of work for organizations. So Hyperproof is a system to allow you to keep up with those compliance demands every day. We focus more on the program that you're running every day, automating it, and being able to respond to audits and being able to collaborate with the necessary team, then that's really the place where we focus most. And then we actually lead you all the way through the audit with audit capabilities, so you can work with your auditor and everything is really kept in a lockbox. So we like to think of Hyperproof as your system of record for continuous compliance. So if you get a chance, visit us on hyperproof.io. I think there'll be some follow-up resources here that JC will also be providing, but we'd love to talk to you about the solution. It's kind of new, so it's been out for less than 6 months, very innovative. We recently won an honorable mention in the Fast Company World-Changing Technology Awards for 2020, so we're very proud of that. So if you have any interest there, please join us on the Hyperproof journey. So now let me transition over to JC. Any questions and answers that you want to throw at me, or questions at me or Matt?
Sure, yes, we do. So we have one question. How long do you think the state of affairs will last? That's one question. Either of you feel free to answer.
I can start, and Matt, feel free to add. I'll just give my take. It depends what's meant by the current state of circumstances. So certainly, I think a lot of the discussion in the news is around how we interact physically, getting back to a work environment and social environments that we're more used to. But I think what's pretty clear from the discussion here is that the digital hangover, if you want to call it, from those kinds of restrictions and those changes in expectations that employees have is going to be around for a while. And I'll give you an example. At our company, we had already allowed some remote work. We're all working remotely now, but even when we come back to the office when it's safe to do so, we're actually increasing the amount of remote work that we're allowing people to do, which of course has a knock-on effect in terms of the tooling that we look at to keep people productive and what is our basic digital footprint. So I think, on the one hand, I hesitate a little bit to say it this way, but I think some of the changes are actually permanent. But I don't think it's bad necessarily. It could be, they could represent still fairly incremental changes to people's behaviors, but they still have a lasting digital impact that needs to be taken into account in compliance. And obviously that's a very general answer. You can talk about different sub areas, but that's how I would kind of highlight it. How about you, Matt?
Well, I think actually it's interesting that this question is asked today, because just before we started this webcast, I saw news from Facebook where Mark Zuckerberg had announced that most of their employees are right now working from home as a temporary basis, but he is going to transition to most employees will be encouraged to work from home forever. And we also saw Twitter not long ago say that their work from home shift will now be permanent. And even if some employees could come back to work at some point, that they're not going to expect the employee to come back to work, potentially ever. If you can work from home, rock out, do it. That's good. We're going to see more and more of that. I think that once we do get a vaccine in everybody's arm, first off, that's 18 months away at least. Even if we get vaccines started, once to get it to any high level where we could really seriously about let's have most people come back to work, that's a long ways off. So I do think compliance executives and security officers need to start thinking now about the changes that we've already made for the last 3 months, and maybe they were going to be for another 3 or 6 months. What if we don't ever come back? What part of this could be a permanent part of our organization? And if it is permanent, well, what does that mean for the compliance capabilities that we would need? What does that mean for the investment strategies that we need? If we knew for a fact that we were all going to be back in the office by January, sure, arguing to invest in compliance might be a little bit tricky, but it gets a lot more tricky if we know that we're going to resume the normal in 6 or 8 months. But if we decide we're never going to come back to normal, we're always going to have half of our workforce go from home forever, then suddenly I would say that a lot of the compliance investment argument becomes easier, because you can say this is an investment for our big long-term shift that's never going to go away. Now, you're going to need to know what exactly are we investing in, what capabilities do we need, but certainly if I think a lot of the state of affairs is going to last for years, and then suddenly you do have to start thinking about what are the priorities we want to emphasize and how would I make that business case. But if it's a permanent change in the way of life, it gets easier to argue we need to invest for the future because we know that this is the future. That's what I'd have to say.
Makes a lot of sense. JC, any other questions that have been asked?
Yep. Here's another one. With more constraints in place and fewer resources, how should compliance officers prioritize? What should they consider doing immediately?
Matt, if you want to start, and then I can give it a couple thoughts.
How would I answer that? Well, anything that is a regulatory requirement goes to the top of the priority list because you can't not do it. Anything that might involve a material weakness in data security or financial reporting that could lead to a significant regulatory infraction down the road, that has to get cleaned up more immediately than anything else. I would also think, though, about, what can we prioritize to automate or somehow make it easier to conduct sales? Because, look, we all need sales. All need the more sales, the merrier. Sales are not going to be easy right now. So if there are certain compliance tasks that you could automate, such as the ability to produce a security audit, so the sales team can go off and say, we're good, so please sign this master agreement with us right now. Anything to help the sales team close sales because it makes your business a more attractive third party and business partner, that also would move up to the top of the line. So those are some of my ideas.
And what I would add to that, that's great thinking, Matt. What I would add to that is to focus on the areas that have changed more. That's been the theme through this discussion, things that have been more ties, places where you see more stress or more seams in the organization. When we were contemplating which offers of our product to make free during the COVID period of time, we actually looked at some of the privacy offerings because we said, hey, that's where people are going to be wondering about testing and, people's temperatures and those kinds of things. Let's get a set of controls out there that actually make it easier for people to actually contemplate those challenges. So I think you will see a little bit of a concentration in the areas around human resources, your internal employees, privacy, and those things. And then the other big one would be all the new security vector risks, given the new ways of interacting. We already saw with Zoom, they had to do a lot of security work in a very short period of time because people were just, interrupting meetings and doing those kinds of things. So I think it's really about, those privacy issues and those new security vectors. That is where I would focus my attention.
Yeah.
All right, we have just a couple of minutes. Stacey, are there any additional questions?
Let's see. I have not seen any additional questions, so we can wrap up. Craig and Matt, are there any just last words or last thoughts you want to share with our attendees?
I would just reemphasize the point that compliance and risk management are going to converge. I think the sooner we accept that point and grasp the implications of it and then try and position your compliance program to serve that need, the more of a strategic asset a strong compliance program would be to the business and to the board. So think about that. A lot of the risks that the board will worry about are going to be big and grave, but they aren't compliance per se. But the board doesn't care. The board cares about what's a big deal. So the more you can design your compliance program to help with risk management and help the board, the better off you as a member of the team will be. And I think that's probably the point worth remembering as we go through all this.
And I would add from my side, it sounds trite, but times of great challenges, I think, are also times of great opportunity. I think going into this particular pandemic, this situation was unprecedented. And I would say that going into it, we wondered if that was true. But I think as we've worked through in the last 2 or 3 months, we've seen a lot of evidence that, if you could think creatively about how to help customers, how to educate the community, how to step up and, maybe sacrifice a little bit for, the greater good of what's out there, that those acts of good karma really actually come back as people are kind of starting to emerge from kind of almost this hibernation or slumber. We're starting to see some of those kind of mirror back at us. And so I've been really, really optimistic about that, that you can really lead into something like this, do better work, and use it as an opportunity to perhaps change some of the things in yourself that you wanted to change, whether it's the example that Matt was talking about around getting out there more and being more extroverted and taking more leadership, being clearer about what you want to do. It's all opportunity, and it's all, it's exciting. We've had customers who said, thank you for the work you're doing right now. We absolutely need that during this difficult time. So just realize that there's a lot of people out there that are waiting for your leadership, and go out and apply it and challenge yourself, and we'll come out of it better than we went into it.
That makes sense. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Craig. And thank you so much, everyone, for spending this hour with us. We really hope that you took something useful and valuable from this, and we will see you next time. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.